Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We are still at the first day of the 2041 to 2042 offseason. There's going to be a parade in Buffalo in the coming days, as after a 162 regular season, we did win our third World Championship in the past 8 seasons. So that is the positive news. The negative news is that we are very low on money heading into 2042 as we attempt to defend a title. We're actually negative in terms of money. And we also have two pretty important hitters in Luis Comaduran and Mike Broughton headed to free agency, as well as an important reliever in Jimenez. So we're losing several important players off of the team, most likely. And even with those losses, we're going to have to likely move on from some other players to be able to do anything to try to fill the gap between where we're going to be without those players going forward. So should be a interesting off season for us. One final episode today before we get into the off-season activity, though. We're going to take a look at our farm system, take a look at some of our former players and some of the top prospects around baseball. But before we get into that, I want to touch upon a few comments from our previous episodes that I thought were interesting. Both Dralix and Wyme943 brought up perhaps trying to sign some of these younger players in our system to longer term contacts. That's a lever that we have pressed in the past. Did it to a lot of success with Deshaun Seifu, although he's on a different contract now. We did it with Jace Barofin and Tim Hull with kind of meh results. Worked out okay with Mike Heiner. Worked out reasonably well with Sincere Shazier thus far. Got a lot of good quality years from him at lower numbers than the $14 million he made this past season. Unfortunately, now he's kind of heading into the more expensive part of that contract since it was not one that was front-loaded. We've talked a lot in comments to recent episodes and quite honestly over the last season or two about potentially moving on from him with a trade. We have shopped him, and the market for him is very tepid. Unfortunately, we're not going to get much of anything of value in return. And quite honestly, to not retain any of his contract, we're going to have to probably include a decent-ish player with him. So he's not quite negative value, but he's definitely being viewed as a pretty fully valued player by the teams that are considering trading for him. So still think that moving on from that $15 million we're going to owe him next year if we don't trade him is probably the right decision. So we'll be looking to do that most likely in the first few days of this coming off season. But back to the original point from Dralix and Wyme943 about trying to sign some of these younger players to long-term contracts. Have kind of reviewed the situation. Josh Porter, despite being a part-time player this year, knows his value and is looking for big money. And not surprisingly, after an incredible rookie season, Jim Lance is looking for massive money as well. Kind of in the middle range are guys like Mike Whitehead and Alejandro Contreras, where we'll consider giving them a contract. And honestly, David Espinoza is kind of in a similar situation as well, where didn't feel like there was anything imminent to do, but something that I'll keep monitoring. But we have in very short order or very recent history, meaning the last hour of real life time before I started making this video, offered a long-term extension to Luis Palencia. This is a guy who we really like his profile. He's 25 years old, and he just finally made it to the majors this year. He was respectable in 8 2/3 innings. The 5 walks is not great, but the 14 strikeouts is. He's fragile physically, and he doesn't quite have ideal stamina to be a starter. So he's kind of viewed more as a relief pitcher, but the amount of money he was looking for, less than $2 million a season. So it seems like he's a guy who has come up through our organization after he was an international amateur free agent 6 years ago. But he was an older international amateur free agent, and he also, as I said, really didn't make his major league debut till he was almost 25 years old, and he's fragile physically. So we made an offer to him that's not a ton of money and could give him financial security and lock him up. So we'll see what happens with that. More potentially impactful is Ishmael Velasco, who is a rookie this season, is likely to be competing with Jim Lance for the Rookie of the Year and was named an All-Star, as well as a couple days ago the World Series MVP. And we made him a more significant offer. It's a 9-figure contract, a little over $100 million. I think it was for 8 or 9 years. Actually, I'm sure if I go onto my transaction screen, I can see the terms of both of these rather than making them up and talking through them with you. Velasco buying out all of his, buying out several free agency years, but also paying up in these coming minimum seasons and arbitration seasons above what he was expected to make, all balances out to $102 million over 9 years. We did put some team options in towards the end of that contract in the higher priced years in case it really doesn't work out. And then, as I said, Palencia was asking for a little over $2 million a year. He was willing to consider locking himself up for 10 years at $17.5 million. Again, I question whether he's really going to have the stamina and or the physical strength to be a consistent starter for us, given that he's already fragile physically. But at the kind of money we'd be paying for him, even if he only ends up as a reliever who's a spot starter for us and spends a fair amount of time on the IL, it's not a contract that scares me at all. So we did get those 2 offers out there. We will see what happens on those fronts. And separately from those contract offers, I spent a lot of time in our recap episode, our last episode, talking about Deshaun Seifu and his very impressive postseason career. And I referenced several times while talking about him checking with Baseball Reference on the records. And Jackhammer Possessor, in a very kind and polite way, said, "Hey, dummy, most of that information is right in OOTP. Why don't you just pull it up there?" And I'm so used to going to Baseball Reference for that type of information that I don't really think of OOTP as being a repository of statistical information, but it is. So it was a great suggestion by Jackhammer Possessor, and it does kind of document that Deshaun Seifu at this point is kind of up there with Derek Jeter in terms of being a career leader in many offensive categories for the postseason. Deshaun Seifu's 124 career games, the most all-time, 33 doubles, 19 triples, 59 steals, as we talked about, also the most all-time, along with his 10 caught stealings. So Mr. Seifu is still 2 rings away from what Mr. Jeter achieved in his career with the Yankees. But as I said, he is on the leaderboard with him quite extensively as far as career postseason batting, which is kind of cool to see. And it's kind of funny. I just clicked on Jeets, and his fictional picture here has some facial hair. So believe it was probably a Boston Red Sox fan or some type of Yankees hater who made up that fictional picture for Mr. Jeter. Taking a look at some of Jeter's career records and where Seifu stands. Seifu still over 100 at-bats behind Jeter, so we'll have to have another couple long postseason runs to catch him there. Terms of career runs, Seifu 28 behind Jeter. So again, we're going to have to consistently get in the playoffs the next few years before Seifu likely retires, and have a lot of success as a team to play a lot of games, and individually from Seifu to get him there. Career hits Seifu 33 away, so that probably another 2 or 3 good postseasons away. Total bases, Seifu still pretty far behind Jeter, unlikely to get him there. And then singles for his career, Seifu 30 behind Jeter. But the fact that Seifu has already passed easily, well, not easily, but he's passed Jeter in doubles this past postseason. And as we talked about last time, he is off the charts in terms of the number of triples he has produced. He is the Babe Ruth of postseason triples compared to the rest of the history of Major League Baseball. And interestingly, I did see something in here because I had looked at Baseball Reference last time, and as some of you I noted, I think it was Stanley Rosella who noted that Baseball Reference includes the Negro League players, whereas OOTP's stats do not. So that's why we don't see the 7 steals from Steel, or 7 triples from Steel Arm Davis that were listed as Baseball Reference. But it is kind of interesting that Baseball Reference also had Rafael Furcal tied with 5 postseason triples with Brett and Jeter. I wouldn't think that a player who played that recently, there would be any controversy around his statistics, but I don't actually see Furcal listed anywhere in here. So kind of wondering what's going on with that, but it's not something that I am going to spend much time figuring out. But thanks to Jackhammer Possessor for the good suggestion as far as giving you a little more to look at while I'm talking about some of these postseason records, and also making it a much more efficient process for me to do that myself. And with my long and somewhat random and rambling preludes out of the way, on to what the main meat of this episode is. And first topic is talking about our minor league system. And after having one of the top-ranked minor league systems at the beginning of this year, you can see we are ranked middle of the pack at the end of the season. Part of that is Lance, who was one of the top prospects in baseball, being a major leaguer, and the development of Velasco into what we hope, particularly with the contract we've offered to him, will be an all-star level major league player for many years to come. So we've lost some key talent out of the system. And in terms of our budgetary issues, we did have a higher draft budget last year because of the 2 compensatory first-round picks that we had. So I was going to try to take that back, but because we're negative, it doesn't like what I'm doing. Hold, please. All right, when I saw that our recommended draft slots for next year were significantly less than what we had budgeted, I, in my anal mind, wanted to start fixing that. So we actually do technically have money available next year now with the changes we had to make, but we also had to pare our scouting and development budgets back as well to 16 and 32 million respectively. Again, this says we've got less than $1 million to spend, still losing all of those free agents that we talked about. So if we do get Shazier and some other players off the books, that might let us make a run at someone like Coma Duran, but hopefully when all is said and done, the moves that we make will also let us invest a bit more in scouting and player development going forward. Back to the prospects. Juan Toledo, you may remember our international free agent signing from a couple of years ago, and we spent a lot of money on him. It was a year that we had money to spend, and it was also a year that we actually traded for some extra money and decided to go big. Looking at our scouting report on him, still think that contact and home run power combination could be excellent. But to date, he has struggled, and this is one thing that bothers me a little bit about OOTP, quite honestly. If any of you have ideas on what you've done to make this work better, would love to hear him. But I've definitely found, and I think it's been more prevalent in this version of the game 24 than previous games, that I have players who end up becoming really good major leaguers, and I hope that Toledo is in that group, who are just complete disasters for 2-3 seasons at rookie ball. And this past year, he struck out 95 times in 155 at-bats. Just kind of ridiculously horrible performance with that 135 batting average. Taking a look at what our scout thinks, taking a look at his personality, taking a look at the fact that he's ranked the number 14 prospect in baseball, I still think that he's going to end up being a pretty productive and good player, which is not what you would typically expect from a guy who's hit a .42 and a .35 in his first 2 years in the DSL. So to me, that's a little bit glitchy with the game. Would like to see a little more realistic statistics and development for those players. But as long as he gets to where we hope he can be overall over the next 3 or 4 years, it will all work out. Chris Lott, number 64 prospect in baseball, the second best prospect in our system, was a supplemental first-round pick back in 2037. Split this year between High A Jamestown, 5-4 with a 4 ERA, and Double A Utica, where he was 8-3 with a 3.36 ERA. Very good ERA pluses and FIP minuses at both levels. Just turned 23 after the season was over. Presumably he'll be starting in AAA next year, and hopefully will be a guy who could help our rotation in the not-so-distant future. He's got a potential 5-pitch arsenal outside of his changeup and his fastball. We don't think any of those pitches are much better than average to slightly above average, but still think that a 5-pitch arsenal with plus stamina, plus ability to hold runners and control that we think could be really good could add up to a nice solid number 2 or number 3 starter in the majors. Solano Toselli, the number 88 prospect in baseball, international free agent signing from almost 4 years ago at the beginning of 2038. Split the year between rookie ball and A ball, 3-8 with a 5.03 ERA in A ball this year as a 21-year-old. Did strike out 100 batters over 73 1/3 innings, but somehow gave up 16 home runs. Still think with his profile, looks like a 3-pitch guy, maybe a 4-pitch guy if we get lucky with that changeup. But at almost 22 years of age, it doesn't seem like we're going to get very lucky there. But still think he could be a useful back-of-the-rotation arm in a few seasons. And our final and fourth top 100 prospect, Danny Black. We picked him in the first round this year. He was our first supplemental pick in the first round, the second of our 3 first-round picks overall. 2-0 with a 4.65 ERA in rookie ball as an 18-year-old. Did strike out 51 in 40 2/3 innings, but he walked 36 as well. A lot of work for him to become what we hope he can be, but according to our scout, there's still an incredible amount of potential here. And if that changeup is able to develop, he could be one heck of a starter. At the very least, if neither the slider nor the changeup develop, I think he could still be a devastatingly effective relief pitcher. But the hope is certainly that over time he gets a 3rd or a 4th pitch of major league or better quality, and he's able to be a high-volume starter for us, particularly given his durability and his good stamina in the years to come. And we also have 4 prospects who are ranked between number 100 and 200. Most notably on the list is Jeff Frakowiak, who we took first with our first round pick in 2039. Was a decision that many of you opined upon in the comments, and it was a tough decision for us. The other guy that we liked, thankfully, ended up being there with our second selection, so we got both of the guys that we liked. Frack has not developed the way we would have hoped. He's been out for almost a year and a half now with a torn labrum in his shoulder, so who knows what he's going to look like over what should have been 3 minor league seasons at this point. He's only pitched in 11 games, no games since June of 2040, and he's had an over 10 ERA in both of the seasons that he did actually pitch. On paper or on the computer screen, still looks like he could be a useful to good major league pitcher if he can develop to his full potential. But at this point, coming off of a torn labrum that has cost him a season and a half at this point, who knows what he's going to look like in a couple months when we're hoping he's healthy. Still crossing our fingers that Frakowiak turns out to be a useful major league pitcher and hopefully even a good major league pitcher, but definitely hasn't gone the way that we would have hoped so far. Jim Coles, first round pick here in 2041. He was the third of our 3 first round picks, 3-3 with a 5.82 ERA in single A ball. He was the veteran compared to the others that we picked out of Louisiana Tech. We put him right in single A out of college, and he held his own there. Did strike out 84 batters in the 68 innings, but did give up 13 homers and 39 walks. Definitely wasn't good, but it wasn't the type of complete statistical disaster that we've seen with the likes of Frakowiak, for instance. So the hope is Coles may be someone who can help us in the major leagues in the next couple of years. Andres Alfaro, a scouting discovery from 2040, still at our international complex. Looks like he could be a pretty interesting player. His contact and his gap power, along with his incredible speed, certainly mean that he could be a guy who gets a lot of hits and a lot of extra base hits. He's a guy who looks like he could potentially play multiple infield positions. Just turned 18, so he's a long way off. Likely would think he'll probably be in the DSL next year, but someone whose career that will follow. And then Luis Nava, a guy who we brought up right at the end of this past season, 0 for 1 in 2 games. Picked him up in that Bobby Bolig trade with Colorado a few years ago. Like his defense, like his ability to bunt, he's got some different speed. It looks like he can make good contact. The issue is how much power is he going to have at the major league level and how many walks is he going to draw, and that'll probably be the determinant of whether he becomes an everyday player with a long career or a guy who is kind of fighting for a roster spot for however long he remains in the majors. Few other notable guys who aren't in the top 200 to check in on. Pat Carmen, first round pick in 2040, 4-2 with a 5.31 ERA in rookie ball this year. As an 18-year-old, turned 19 right about the time the rookie ball seasons were ending. Still another guy who is a decent pitching prospect for us. We talked about the second and third guys that we picked with our 3 first-round picks this year. John Wisniewski is the guy that we picked with our first pick, number 33 overall. He was 1-2 with 9 saves, 15 walks, and 24 strikeouts in 16 innings as our closer in rookie ball as an 18-year-old. Still certainly see him as having a very high ceiling if he fully develops. He did better in rookie ball than a lot of guys do at the age of 18 in their first go-round as a professional. Hopefully we can get him a little more than 16 innings pitched next season. But still looks like he could be an interesting guy for us down the line. I mentioned that we took Frack with our first pick a few years ago. The other guy that we were considering was Gregorio Garola, who fortunately fell to us with the 83rd pick in the draft. He was 3-2 with a 6.49 ERA this year. We've been starting him. I don't think he's a starter at the major league level. I think the right-hander is likely a reliever if he ends up being a pitcher at the major league level. But we're trying to get him as much experience as possible, so we're forcing him into the starting rotation, even though that's probably not where he'd be useful on the pitching staff at the major league level. The reason we considered him over Frack, though, was that Garola is a two-way player, and he's actually, was productive enough this year in rookie ball that hitting-wise, he certainly deserves a promotion to A-ball, and given that he's now 20 years old, we'll promote him to A-ball next year. He hit only 247, but with 7 homers, 28 ribbies, and just 93 at-bats, put up a 118 WRC plus for us. I think he's ready for single A as a hitter. I don't know that he's quite ready for single A as a pitcher yet, but presumably at 20 years old with 3 years of rookie ball behind him, we'll most likely be putting him up in single A next season. One final guy to check in on is Chad Aguirre, relief pitching prospect who we picked in the 3rd round a year ago. Has had a rough start to his career with ERAs above 6 in both of his first 2 years as a reliever in the minors and rookie ball. Still think his profile looks like if he fully develops, he could become a pretty useful left-handed arm out of the bullpen. No guarantees that that's going to happen, but we've been a little more aggressive these last few years with guys like Wisniewski and Aguirre in terms of taking some reliever prospects a little earlier in the draft than we typically have in the past. So with a review of some of our top prospects complete, we'll turn to some of the other top prospects around baseball, or some players that we thought about drafting or wished we could have drafted or signed as international amateur free agents years ago. Phil Mullen, 18-year-old pitcher, went number 35 overall. This is a guy that we thought about taking with that 33rd pick, likely would have taken, I can't remember, I think it was 37th and 39th for our next 2 picks if he had made it to us. He's part of the Nashville organization. He didn't sign early enough to end up pitching for them at all this year. Certainly is a profile, though, that looks like he could be a pretty good major league starter if he develops, as I'm sure Nashville hopes he does. Ernesto Zambrana, international free agent signing. His stuff looked like it was off the charts when he was originally a prospect. Looks like perhaps expectations have been tamped down a bit. 20 years old now, viewed as the number 24 prospect in baseball. Still hasn't made it out of rookie ball, though. 2-2 with a 3.35 ERA there this year for the Reds organization. 2 straight years with excellent ERA pluses and FIP minuses in rookie ball. Would have to assume that the Reds will promote Zambrana to single A next year. Luis Zapata, another pitching prospect coming off of a torn PCL, went 2-4 with an 8.44 ERA in rookie ball. Left-handed pitcher, another guy who's 20 years old. He was the 36th overall pick a year ago, a guy that we had considered. And I know that some of you in the comment section were very interested in him. Quite honestly, his profile doesn't overwhelm me at this point. Taking a look at the scouting report on him, it looks like we think a lot less of him now, a year and a half after we thought about drafting him, than even we thought of him when he was originally a prospect. Definitely don't see him being a starter, so if we make him a reliever, his stuff would certainly look a little better. but he also only throws in the low 90s, so no guarantees that the lefty is going to become a big-time player. The last pitcher, Jorge Rente, left-hander who is up with the Expos now, 1-0 with a 10.12 ERA. Looks like they used him as a pure lefty specialist because he pitched 8 games, but only 2 2/3 innings. So he was coming in as a loogie like back in the late 80s and 90s. Still a pretty interesting pitching profile. Looks like he could be a useful to good starting pitcher if he can get the last bits of development that our scout still thinks are potentially out there for the milkman to achieve. And I guess there was one pitcher left. If I was good at counting, I would have figured that out. Frank Ramos, a reliever who was in last year's draft. His stuff still off the charts. His cutter still off the charts. He, coming out of Ball State, is a bit older, almost 24 years old. 5-3 with 24 saves for Double-A Pensacola this year. A little surprised he wasn't promoted to Triple-A, given that he had 99 strikeouts in 58 innings pitched. But probably a guy who could be a pretty useful major league reliever in relatively short order. The big question with him is how many guys he's going to walk. Still working on his control at this point. Turning to the position players, by special request from Dralix, we'll take a look at Joep Spreckley. He was a player that we looked at a long time ago at this point. Almost 10 years ago, he got a $5.7 million max bonus from the Orioles organization, was a perennial top 10 prospect in the majors. And when we look back at our scouting reports for him, when he was being picked up as an international amateur free agent, we thought this was a guy with 80, and 70 contact, power, and eye potential. So our thought was that he was going to be an incredible hitter, and you can see just has not turned out that way. He is 26 years old right now, and he spent this past year in A-ball for some reason, which does seem like a very curious decision by the Diamondbacks organization. Hit .353 with 15 homers and 84 ribbies in A-ball, so very dominant at that level. But looking at what our scout thinks he is, the lack of speed, lack of defense, and fragile injury proneness, Spreckley, at almost 27 years old, is a player who still hasn't made it to the majors, possibly never will, and a lot of unfulfilled promise given how good he looked as a prospect less than a decade ago. Guadalupe Amezcua was one of the top prospects in our system. He was a guy who was actually not an international amateur free agent. He was a scouting discovery by our scout. One of the top prospects in our system. We ended up, I don't want to say souring on him, but I think we kind of felt like he was never going to become the player that we thought he could, and we used him a couple years ago in that trade to pick up our current second baseman, Mr. Contreras. Amezcua was a top 40-ish prospect at the time, and we had to include a lot of other big-time players and prospects, too, to get the deal done. He did make it up to AAA this year, spent the year at high A, double A, and then AAA, 242 average with 6 homers and 120 at-bats at AAA. Still like his defensive versatility. Question is whether he's going to make enough contact and avoid strikeouts well enough to ever be much of a major league hitter. He's also now 25 years old, so Amezcua should end up playing in the majors, and you can see he's actually on Houston's roster right now, even though he hasn't played in the majors yet. So a guy who's turned out better than Spreckley, but definitely not likely to achieve the ceiling range potential we once felt he had. Last but not least, Pat Moody. This is a guy who looked like a really big time prospect coming out of Texas in this year's draft. Went third overall this year, the number 3 prospect in baseball. Raked in brief stints in rookie ball and A ball, and still hit 286 with a homer and 7 ribbies and 21 at bats at high A ball before his first professional season ended. Still looks like an excellent contact and power combination if he fully develops. And with that high work ethic and adaptability, odds are he probably will. So the 22-year-old Moody in the Royals organization looks as if he's a guy who could be a pretty interesting player at the major league level, probably sometime next year. And with the review of our prospects and some other prospects complete, the last thing we want to do is visit the increasingly large list of some of our former players, see how the guys on the Buffalo Wings, who in many cases helped us win our first 2 championships, are doing in other organizations. Won't go into quite as much depth with all of these players. Jorge Carrillo, 12-9 with a 3.30 ERA for Montreal this year. Looks like that was probably the best season he's had with them since he signed as a free agent when we let him go. Juan Estrada, traded him away about a year ago for our new shortstop, Andrus. Estrada making big money at $26 million. 10-7 with a 4.51 ERA for the Red Sox this year. And they used him more often as a two-way guy than we did. He played 144 games total, hit 280 with no homers, 39 ribbies over 547 at-bats. Was a just barely slightly above average offensive player according to his WRC+. We were a little more strategic with Estrada, playing him pretty much only against right-handed pitching, and he wasn't in the lineup for us against left-handed pitching, and that enabled him, or helped him, perhaps have that 122 WRC+ that he put up over the course of his career with us, by limiting his action a little bit at the plate to the players that we felt he could be most effective against. So definitely has a profile that could have helped us this past year, but we won the World Series without Mr. Estrada, so we wish him well in Boston, but can't say that we miss him all that much since we were still able to win the title without him. Isidro Ochoa looks like he's moved on to the Mets from the Braves, 7-13 with a 4.81 ERA. Ali Ostendorf, 10-15 with a 4.03 ERA. Drake Purvis, 11-8 with a 4.03 ERA, the left-handed starter with the Cardinals, now a torn UCL. Looks like he's going to miss the beginning of next year. And finally, among the pitchers, the last time we will get to talk about the traitorous Canadian Lorne Walborn. His career really imploded after he moved on from us, lasted just 3 more seasons in the majors. I know it was a controversial decision when we were not as aggressive trying to re-sign him as some of you may have hoped that we had been, but in retrospect, he's a guy who kind of fell off the map in his early to mid-30s. Split this year between the Rangers and the Giants. Had ERAs above 8 in very small sample sizes with both teams, and he subsequently retired at the end of this season. So 8 years and 40 days of Major League service time for Mr. Walborn. And the best of those seasons were with our Buffalo Wings. All 3 of his All-Star appearances were with us. The Mariano Rivera Award was with us, and he was a member of our first 2 World Series teams as the stopper who led the league in games and holds for 4 consecutive seasons in the prime of his run with Buffalo. Turning to our former position players, catcher Andres Medina did Andres Medina things this year, hitting a buck 96. Did have 13 homers and 403 at bats. Still an excellent defensive catcher at the age of 34. Arturo Flores, kind of doing Arturo Flores things, hitting 238, but did have 29 homers and 87 ribbies for the Los Angeles Angels. Shamar Jenneret, this has been kind of nice to see, although it looks like he missed the last month of the season with a torn ab for the Red Sox. He really struggled the first 2 years after he left Buffalo with Boston, was not productive in 2037, and then was very injury prone in 2038. But these last 3 seasons, he hasn't been prime Shamar Jenneret, which fortunately we had the 3 years that he was with us. But he's gone back to being one of the top offensive players in the game these last 3 years in his mid-30s with the Red Sox, which has been nice to see, earning some of that big contract he signed with them. Looks like he's got 1 year left at $26 million, and then he will be on the market again as a free agent. Steve Anderson, our longtime second baseman, we let him leave as a free agent. Him moving on from us gave us one of those compensatory first-round picks that we've talked about. And he had by far the best offensive season of his career this year with Washington. A 133 WRC plus for the Nationals, 22 homers, 86 ribbies, hit over 300. Again, he was looking for a lot of money. He was fragile physically, and we won the World Series without him. So similar to Juan Estrada, I can't complain about not having him because everything worked out, but certainly put together a really nice offensive season. Our hope is that the likes of Contreras and Andrus and Whitehead stabilize our second base and shortstop position in the absence of Anderson for the next few years at a lot less money combined for those three than we would have been paying for Anderson. Cam Collier, 239 average, 13 homers. Looks like he's probably getting close to the end of the line. Joe Edwards kind of does Joe Edwards things, 226 average and 27 homers, but 93 walks, partially offset by the 157 strikeouts, all added up to a 113 WRC plus and a 3 WAR. Jorge Climaco, this is a guy who we probably undervalued when we traded him away a couple years ago. He's gotten a chance with Houston each of the last 2 seasons, hit over 300 a year ago, batted just 206 and 180 at-bats at the major league level this year. Still looks like he could be a pretty decent average hitter with plus contact and gap power, decent speed, and a guy who's rarely going to strike out. But with the depth we have in the outfield, not really missing him too much. Could say similar things about Tim Gaglia, hit just a buck 89 in 200 and 555 at-bats. Bobby Bolig, after a brilliant season a year ago, really struggled this year, 246 with 6 homers and 31 ribbies and 260 at-bats. Presumably he missed some time due to injury. Tyreek Hardage hit 217 over 598 at-bats for the Angels. 31 years old now. Can't say we miss him all that much. And then Mike Heiner, I think we got out of him just about the right time. He's really been a disaster since we traded him away in the middle of the 2040 season. Had a combined 7 at-bats for the Giants and the Orioles this year in the majors. Did hit 266 and 218 at-bats in AAA. I guess somebody must have released him because it says his contract is only $840,000. Someone must have just sucked it up. Yeah, he was released by the Giants. Wow, we traded him to the Giants on July 1st of 2040, and they bit the bullet on his contract, or what was left of his contract, on April 10th of the next year. So it was largely a salary dump that did net us Mr. Coma Duran. We had to include some good prospects to get Coma Duran, to be fair, but Heiner looks like he may be near the end of his useful run as a major leaguer. And those of you who have been watching closely know that I may have skipped over Mr. Joe Gallagher. He'll be the last guy that we'll talk about. And the bad attitude, bad defense, bad base runner, bad bunter, bad contact hitter, bad strikeout ton guy who does happen to have some pop in his bat. Kind of did Joe Gallagher things again this year. He had that resurgent year with the 112 WRC plus his first year in Nashville. This year he went more back to being bad Joe Gallagher, 172 average with 11 homers and a sickly 122 strikeouts in just 320 at-bats, 63 OPS plus, -2 WAR. We were happy to move on from Gallagher, even though he's reasonably priced compared to some of the other guys available. But we'll deal with a bad personality if it's a great player. Gallagher was kind of always a very marginal player despite the big home run numbers he put up sometimes. So even though he's only 28 years old, he may have some useful years ahead of him. Can't say that I'm disappointed that we moved on from nasty Joe Gallagher. And one final thing to note before we finish up the episode, we did have an option year on our stopper, Nate Ruckel, for $4 million next year. Some of you suggested in the comments to the last episode maybe looking to trade Ruckel away. It's still something we could do because he's made $5 million this year, and we happen to have him on a $4 million team option for next year. So we obviously exercise that option. Given that we are still in it to win it next season and we're going to try to defend this title, I think it's unlikely that we'll move on from him. $4 million with that profile and the fact that he typically goes out and gives us 140, 150 innings a year in a high-volume stopper role. I think he's a pretty valuable left-handed pitcher out of our bullpen, and he has done a great job, as we've talked about in the past, filling in the gap that was created when we moved on from Walborn a few years ago. So Ruckel likely will be back with us next year, but we're going to be exploring a lot of options in the trade market over the next couple of weeks till we get to arbitration and free agency. Shazier is the most obvious guy that we potentially would like to move on from, but as we talked about in our previous episodes, there might be some decisions to trade away some of our catchers, maybe trade away some of our outfielders, and ultimately we're going to have to, in relatively short order, decide whether we're going to try to re-sign either of the potential outfield free agents in Broaden and Coma Duran. Broaden, I think we're definitely moving on from. Coma Duran, I'd love to still have that bat against right-handed pitching on our team. He does have a profile with a really good batting profile, durability, that I'm willing to deal with some negative personality traits with him. He gets a much longer rope than somebody like Joe Gallagher did because he's a much better player than Gallagher ever was and ever will be. Looking for about $20 million a year, so he's going to be pretty fully priced. But he's a pretty important guy to our offense, and particularly if we're able to trade away Shazier, maybe move on from some of the guys we have options through arbitration on, and maybe pare back what we're spending on catcher somehow, which would likely mean getting rid of Miller or Houlihan, and then keeping one of them to pair with Berrios next year. If we make some moves like that and perhaps move on from some of our relievers, we could potentially open up enough money to consider bringing Coma Duran back, and that's something that I'll be thinking about. As always, appreciate all the comments to our last couple episodes on what we should think about this offseason. If you've got other thoughts, speak now or forever hold your peace, because in our next episode, we're going to start making some decisions. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.